we'll talk about learning about technology. Um, and this lecture is going to be a little bit loose and a little bit abstract, similar to how we've discussed the overview of technology management. And I'll share with you some thoughts and further explorations about how learning is done when it comes to technology. If you think about it, learning about technology is nothing really different versus other things that we learn about. And the pattern is typically the same, regardless of the subject matter that we're supposed to learn. Okay? It just so happens that when we talk about technology, there might be some one or two or three peculiar things that would be specific as to how we learn technology. But nevertheless, the patterns can exist even if we're not trying to learn about technology, if we're learning about something else. Um, and when we look at about technology, generally technology is all about technique, it's about transformation, it's about process. So anything to do with technique, transformation, process, how we learn about technology can also be applied in those contexts. So uh, what we'll do today is to take a look at the generalized focus, okay, generalized ideas on how we learn. And then after that, we'll probably try to point out certain things that may be peculiar about learning about technology. But even then, they won't be that many. And still, even if it is still generally applicable, even to non-technology, this is still very useful for us in technology management. So we'll start off with an overview of what I would call learning depths. So the layers of learning, you can put it that way. And then at each learning depth or at each layer, we'll talk about the purpose. Why is there such a thing? Why are we at that depth, or why are we at that level? And then later on, we'll talk about plumbing the learning depth. We'll try to see what activities can be done at each layer, at each level, and then we'll talk about artifacts, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay. So the first idea, okay, what are the learning depths? So what are the layers of learning? Well, the most shallow, and you can probably say the most broad level, would be what we would call convention. Things that we learn in mainstream media, things that we learn from friends, relatives, neighbors, pretty much the common pedestrian, right? So, and this would be convention. And the reason why it's convention, it's probably something that people have learned automatically as obvious, or this would be things that have been generally accepted by a wider or broader group of people. That's why they're accepted as convention. And this is something similar to what we call conventional wisdom. Okay, because the general knowledge that will be gained from convention is something that everybody would know. Okay, it's very rare that certain people will not know. Okay, and oftentimes that circumstance happens because they're probably isolated from a general community, or they may have suffered situations or illnesses like amnesia, for example. Like they probably forget about it, but it's quite unlikely that convention is something that is not accessible to the average person. I mean, this is something that can be read by them, can be appreciated by them. Okay? They may not know the details about it, but uh, they know something. I mean, they know something. They know enough to say that they can have an appreciation of the subject matter. And generally, this is the first level of understanding technology. What's considered as conventional by by society at large. And when we go deeper, okay, so beneath the convention, we look at the literature that is specific to that technology or specific to that methodology or that technique. Okay? But now it's richer, it's more comprehensive, it's extremely detailed. Okay? And this is something that not everyone would appreciate. Generally, the accessibility is still there, but even if it is accessible in terms of being able to search it and find it, once you see it, once you find it, it may not be easy for you to understand it. And that's why the accessibility becomes a little bit impaired or limited. But nevertheless, the literature is available. Okay, it could be available, but it's not easily accessible. Okay, and there are reasons why. Okay, why the literature can be very deep, can be a little bit more comprehensive compared to mere convention. Um, but this is usually the case. I mean, uh, beyond convention, beyond common knowledge or general knowledge, there will be specific knowledge or specialist knowledge, okay, about the specific technology. And that's normally encapsulated or located in what we call literature. And finally, beneath, okay, or deeper than what's available in the literature is what we call novel insight. And the thing here is that not everyone would know novel insight. In fact, it can be very individualized. It can be very personal to you, okay, or to a few of you, a few people, okay, maybe some of your colleagues, but no more than that, okay. And it's novel because it is a much deeper understanding and articulation of what you may have gathered from your literature. Okay. Now, the thing about novel insight is that eventually there could be a mechanism for you to move what is novel insight to literature, and then what may have been a specialist literature item can now be elevated into something that's conventional. So you can see that the flow of complexity and accessibility can go upwards. Okay, so I have something, an insight that I gathered. Okay, I broaden the accessibility to more people, and then now more people get to appreciate it, and then among themselves they can decide that this is something that needs to be brought up mainstream at the level of convention. Okay, that can happen. Okay. Otherwise, you can decide that at the level of novel insight, it just stays there. Maybe it's so specific that the literature, the field, the specialist field may not really appreciate it that much. Or maybe you're trying to hide it, or maybe you're trying to keep it to yourself. Okay, I mean, later on we'll talk about protection, protecting technology. But in any case, when we look at learning depths, we normally look at it from the perspective of accessibility. So so accessibility and complexity are inversely proportional in that sense. The more accessible the knowledge about the technology, the less complex it is. Okay? And it makes sense because if you really want to broaden your audience, okay, not everyone will have the same level or the same depth of knowledge or skill or expertise in order for them to appreciate any specific knowledge item, right? So if you want everyone to appreciate it better, then you try to make it less complex, okay? More understandable, more intelligible to the general public. Now, what's the purpose at each layer, at each learning depth? Okay, at the level of convention, normally you know things because you have to use them. So there is a need to know basic use. How do I use the technology? Okay, what are the basic features? What are the expected outcomes? Basically for use. Um, and it's pretty much limited to that. Okay. Earlier, if you recall, that technology by itself is useless, right? Well, this is your entry point for technology. If you want to make technology useful, you have to know how to use it, and that's your entryway. Okay. Now, but when you go deeper into the literature, you look at the specialist knowledge, right? You're not just simply looking at the use. You're now looking at possible extensions. Okay? And when we talk about extensions, this would refer to maybe better use, or it could mean exceptions to the rule, or it could mean repurposing it for other matters, or combining it with a different field or a different technology in order for you to have newer uses. So these are extensions. Okay, use taken in this context is just simply plain obvious use. But there are times wherein your technology can be used in a non-obvious manner. So that is something that literature will try to advise you. Okay, is it possible for you to use your technology beyond the obvious use, right? How many people have done it? What has been their experience? And there you can find out. The literature will be available for you, and you can see their successes. You can also see their failures. You can also see how they're able to work around certain things. You can see how they can fix things. Okay, so that's part of literature. And lastly, when you go into novel insight, the purpose why you want to have novel insight is, aside from the use and extensions, you really want to have further development. Okay, you really want to make changes. You really want to make improvements or progress. Okay? And that's the whole idea of to why you as to why you want to have specific insight to a certain technology. I mean, a technology need not be limited to the use or its possible extensions. You try to stretch it further, push the boundaries, okay, of the field, okay, and eventually, based on your own experience in trying to stretch it further, developing it further, then you'll have an understanding of whether that's feasible or not. That's part of your objective. So the reason why you'd want to know very specific about that item is because you want to develop it further. Okay, so it's really about development. Now, when you try to access convention, okay, at the basic level, this is really under the field of general experience. Okay, people have general experience. And general experience can mean, well, your everyday life, right? So, for example, cell phone technology or smartphone technology, well, general experience will tell you how to use the phone, how to make a call, how to send text messages, how to connect to the internet, okay? How to swap SIM cards, okay, or how to update certain software. Okay, but that's general experience. You don't really need sophisticated knowledge to be able to do that because your whole purpose is to use it. So this falls under general use as well. So that's in the level of convention. There's nothing complicated there. So there's uh, nothing specific, nothing highfalutin, sophisticated. It's just general use. Okay? And the accessibility for that knowledge is mainstream. Anyone can have access to that. And as soon as they have access to that, as soon as they also have access to the technology, they have a smartphone. Okay, well, for example, they can use it. They know how to use it. Now, when we go to the literature, this is what we typically call the literature review, right? I mean, we go through the literature, we review, we take a look at what has been done in the past, what are the attempts by the people, okay, and we make some sort of an evaluation. Okay, how did they do it? Can I probably do something similar? Or what was their learning, okay, in terms of failure? Okay, if they haven't been successful in this, why weren't they successful in it? So a literature review is meant to give you specialist knowledge about the technology. So for example, if you really want to know how to make your smartphones, let's say, do something a little bit more sophisticated, like you want to make it as a broadcasting studio, for example. Okay, when you take a look at the literature, you look at what might be there. Okay, maybe they've had some procedures. They've taken a look at some workarounds, even if there's no direct way of doing it. Okay, or maybe they are able to work on 6 out of 10 features, but the remaining 4 features is still up in the air. So there's still no clarity on the other 4 features. Okay. So that's what we do in literature review. So in convention, we look at general knowledge. In literature, we look at specific knowledge now. And we do it through a review. Now, lastly, when you have novel insights, The typical activity that happens here are experiments. Okay, and by experiments, we look at it in the same way as how we appreciate the scientific method. I mean, the scientific method is very simple to a certain degree. In fact, your scientific method is really born out of a philosophical construct, right? But the idea of experiments, okay, and this is borrowing from the scientific method, is you start with your givens, right? You start with whatever is available to you, and then you have a hypothesis, you have a guess, and you want to test that guess, and that's why you do the experiments. Okay, even if you don't do something like a pre-post type of scenario, pre-post. So like you do a pre-check, you run the experiment, and you do a post-check. No? So if you don't do a pre-post, and this is typical of social sciences, right? They don't run experiments on people. You still have a hypothesis that you want to test. So either way, um, you have a hypothesis, you want to test your hypothesis, and based on the accepted test, okay, then you'll have your results, and then you interpret your results and come up with a conclusion. That's experiments, okay? And the thing with experiments, I think, with respect to the scientific method, that's really peculiar to the natural sciences or to engineering, is that they are replicable. Meaning, if another person does the same experiment, if the parameters are kept the same in that other instance, then you should have the same result. I mean, that's the idea of experiments, okay, that they can be replicated, and provided that the parameters are the same, you should be able to get the same results. Now, that's not usually the case, right? I mean, there are moments wherein if you try to replicate your experiment and then you don't get the same results. So normally that is good material for publication. You can now say that, the earlier experiments done by so and so, well, there seems to be something wrong with it because I did the same experiment, I got a different result. Okay. But in both cases, you have novel insight. And in both cases, it can be very specific, more specific than specific knowledge. Right? Eventually, the insight that you will gather based on the experiments can be elevated, as I said earlier, into literature. And then, based on the literature, it can now be elevated into mainstream, to convention. But overall, these are the general activities that you will find at each layer. Okay? And as you see, in the highest layer, the most shallow or the most broad layer, the level of activity is not complex. It can happen as you go along. In fact, in general experience, there is this theory that is well known about learning. Right? It's learning by doing. So because you're undergoing that experience, you are executing what is expected of you. Actually, you learn something along the way, and that's still learning. That's legitimate learning, right? It's not something that you can say that, oh, that doesn't qualify as learning. No, it's still learning. It's still valid. It's still something that the people should be made aware of. Okay. On the other hand, when you go through literature review, there's a little bit more sophistication required because now certain literature would have language, specific language, right? They would have terms that only the specialists can understand, right? So if you're not a specialist, you're not in that in club, right? And that's perfectly fine because you're not expected in the mainstream to know these things, right? It's not an expectation that you have a clearer idea on what's going to happen. Okay, that's for the specialists. You give it to them, they will tell you what is needed, what's not needed. Okay, and because they're specialists, they're probably more trained to handle the literature. So as you can see, compared to general experience, this is a little bit more complicated than general experience. You need to have a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more skill, okay, a little bit more patience or tolerance, okay, to go through the material, okay, as opposed to general experience or learning by doing. And deeper than that would be the experiments. Now, this one, as you would probably surmise, is much, much more complex. Okay, because you're the ones who are going to design those experiments. You're going to construct them. And not only will you design and construct them, you'll actually execute the experiments yourselves. But the experiments need not be super complicated in themselves, right? So how is that possible? I mean, the general experience is not complicated. Literature review is slightly complicated. Experiments much more complicated than literature review, but need not be complicated. Okay, so how do we resolve that idea? Well, your experiments, provided you know the context of things, it's easier for you to design an experiment that is straightforward, right? But your understanding as to why you've designed the experiment as such, that is something that's not accessible to everyone. So it may not be immediately obvious to the common bystander, okay, as to why you did your experiment in this way. Maybe to specialists, they would understand it, but to the common citizen, they probably wouldn't care, right? But your scope can be minimal. Your scope can be straightforward. So in that respect, the accessibility or the appreciation of the experiment will require sophistication, but the the degree of implementation need not be deep. It can be simple. It can be straightforward. So I think that's how we try to differentiate it. And sometimes experiments, the simpler the hypothesis, the better for you. But sometimes, if you have a simple hypothesis, it's not that doesn't really lead to a simple design of experiment, right? I mean, sometimes you might be asking many more questions. So from your main hypothesis, you have sub hypothesis still. So that becomes a little bit more challenging, a little bit more complicated as you go with it. Okay. Now, what are the typical artifacts? Okay. So under general experience, what would be things that you normally find about technology? Well, one, you can have manuals. I mean, that's accessible. You can even have comments or articles about critics, okay, criticizing the technology, okay, mentioning things that are not easy to use, perhaps. You have that. Or they can have a very deep appreciation of certain features. I mean, these are critics. Okay. Or you can see it from the perspective of product reviews. I mean, not necessarily critics who may be experts of the technology, but this can be your common user who would probably give you a very general or generic overview as regards how the technology can be used. So you can have product reviews. So these are examples of artifacts that you will see at the level of general experience. Now, what about literature review? What are the things that you'd find in literature review? Well, you can take a look at synthesis. So these would be artifacts, okay, wherein after looking at maybe different embodiments of technology, then you can have like a synthesis of all of these things, have a common ground, a common conclusion about it. Or you'd find what we call marginal analysis. So in general experience, we talk about common use. But around it, the margins, so to speak, you can probably find things in literature that would try to stretch a bit on what could be common use. So that's marginal analysis. So you look at the margins. Now you don't look at the root or at the common area. You look at the margins. So you move away from the center to the envelope. Okay. Or you'd find meta-analysis. So the analysis of the analysis, right? Uh, and this would be maybe they try to look at maybe past literature reviews, past synthesis, past marginal analysis, and they make comparisons. They make their own evaluation, which one is a better analysis over the other, or which one has a better synthesis over the other. And this is also meta-analysis. Okay? And as you can see, these three examples of artifacts at the level of literature review, you would not find that in general experience. Okay, nobody would really care about marginal analysis if your objective is to use it, right? I mean, there's no need for you to know how to integrate all different types of uses. Maybe you're just looking for that one specific feature, that one specific use. I mean, you don't care about anything else. Or marginal analysis, you don't really need to know what happens at the margins. You don't need to know the exceptions. You don't need to know how to really stretch the technology. You just need to know, okay, basic use. Okay? Or you don't even need to know how other people would try to analyze the analysis of others. I mean, that's not, or the more, that's probably not important to you anymore. And this would be best reserved for specialists. But, these things happen and they fall under literature review. So these are things that you normally find in a typical literature review. Okay. And lastly, experiments. What are the usual artifacts? Well, modes of experience. Okay. It can be very simple, freestyle, okay? But that's yours, right? These are your novel insights that you gathered from the experiments. Or it can be publications. You submit journal articles, okay? You submit reports to, not even broadly. I mean, it can be within your own company. You can have your own publications internally, right? And that's still publication. Or you can do presentations. Okay, you present to a crowd like a symposium or a seminar. Okay? And again, it need not be the general public. It can be just you, okay, and your office mates or your colleagues. It need not be the broad public yet. Okay? So these are examples of artifacts at the level of experiments. Okay, so when you do experiments, normally these are the outputs that you would expect to have. Okay, as part of your output for experiments, right? So these are the typical sets that you will experience when you have artifacts. Okay, they're not really, and they're just examples. They're not really meant to be exhaustive as well. But these examples of artifacts would give you an idea that, okay, number one, at every level of learning layer, there has to be some sort of output. There has to be some sort of embodiment, okay, of the knowledge. So the fact that the knowledge has become tangible, okay, that makes it easier for learning to happen. Okay, and expect that learning is much more facilitated if it has some output that can be latched on. Okay, of course, one of the theories of knowledge that has been popularized by Nanaka and Takeuchi regarding tacit knowledge versus explicit knowledge. So they were the ones who popularized tacit knowledge. What tacit knowledge is something that exists in the individual and something that exists in an organization. So if you have a group of people in a company, they know things that only they would know, right? I mean, it wouldn't be embodied in an artifact. And that type of knowledge is called tacit knowledge. Okay. The opposite of that is explicit knowledge, something that is codified in a certain artifact. Okay. And the thing there is that when we talk about artifacts, I mean, ideally, these are all explicit knowledge. But one way for an organization, so they say, that would exemplify maturity when it comes to knowledge would be their ability to capture knowledge and move it from tacit to explicit. I mean, that's something that you'll actually learn, and that's actually one of the articles that you're expected to read, okay, as part of your reaction paper for this module, right? So the difference between tacit and explicit knowledge, okay, which now concludes, right? I'll move into the conclusion now, okay. Uh, the idea that, well, at the end of it all, okay, where we're talking about the learning layers, we look at the different activities, we look at the different purposes, we look at the different outputs at each layer. In the end, what are we trying to accomplish here? Well, there is really a need to structure knowledge management. And this is important when it comes to technology management. If there is no structure in terms as to how you try to learn or to capture that knowledge, then technology management becomes a very tedious exercise. Right? it becomes more difficult because you are now not able to capture the knowledge of the organization very well. And maybe the knowledge that your organization would have would maybe be at the level of convention. Okay. In some cases, that might be acceptable. I mean, you are not going to be an expert in the technology, that's fine. Okay? However, there are instances wherein it might be good that you have people who are specialists in the technology. And for that, they need to have a way to extract knowledge from literature. And once they've extracted it from literature as an organization, you also know how to identify those sources, those references in the literature. Okay. So when we look at convention, one of the implicit objectives of KM or knowledge management is you have to know which one is really useful and emphasize that. Because convention is something very broad, it's something that's accessible to mainstream. It's possible that there are things that may be useful for others but won't be useful for you. So when you try to structure your knowledge management around it, you need to be able to say that, okay, this aspect is useful for me, therefore I will capture it. Therefore, I will make use of it. Okay? Now, at the level of literature, and this is pertinent to specialists, your objective is that you're looking for possibilities. Remember, you're not just simply limiting yourselves to use, you're looking at its extension. So now you're looking for possibilities, you're looking to stretch. Okay? And the thing there is that when you're looking to stretch, you're not exactly looking for something new. Okay? It's possible that somebody would have thought about it. So you take a look first. Has somebody done something about this? More often than not, it's possible that somebody has done it already. Okay. Very good. Now you just learn from it and do it yourself. But later on, in the course of your understanding of the literature, you realize that nobody has attacked the question, and therefore the question of the possibility hasn't been answered. So now you move into that space wherein, do I really want to learn if it's possible or not? And that's where novel insight comes in. And the reason why you want to go into novel insight already is because you want to create an advantage. You want to have something that would benefit you and perhaps only you. Okay? Maybe later on it will benefit other people. Okay, that's good. But it should benefit you first. Otherwise, there's no motivation. Right? There's no motivation for you to run it unless you yourself are convinced that it's something that's going to create some advantage for you at least. It may sound selfish. Okay, yeah. But it's not entirely selfish, right? If you're doing it for somebody else, then okay, then there's the motivation, right? You're doing it for something else, you're for somebody else. But it means that doing it for something else is something that's core to you. So in a way, you're doing it for yourself because you know that you're also doing it for something else, for somebody else, and that's what's important to you. Okay. But regardless, the only time that you will try to probably go through experiments is that if you are confident that there could be an advantage that you can capitalize on. Without that, you wouldn't even bother. That's why a lot of companies would would go to pilots, would run pilots, because theoretically they surmise that there could be an advantage. That's why they run experiments. That's why they run pilots. They do proof of concepts. Right? They have this inkling. They have this hypothesis that of something, and they know that if they answer that question, okay, then there's an advantage for them. Okay, so at least when you're structuring your knowledge management around those areas, then that's something that you are looking for. Okay, and with that, I end my short lecture on learning about technology. It's, as I said, it's nothing super fantastic or super technical, but the whole idea there is that this is like an entryway. It's like an entry point to things that you will learn eventually about technology, the specific things, the specific practices. And one example would be understanding knowledge management, and that's a whole separate field in itself. Okay, uh, when we look at the principles of knowledge management, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, the field of knowledge management, they're supposed to be like knowledge management 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. It has gone through leaps and bounds in terms of really understanding what the technology is about. Okay, and there, I mean, there are many ways about going about it. Um, Another offshoot of learning about technology is we said earlier about experiments. So the theory of experimentation is something that, okay, one of the books that has been an option for you to read would have been by Stefan Famke on experimentation. He's the leading scholar when it talks about experimentation, the benefit of experimentation. And you look more about that. Okay, you look at the various ways of how experimentation can be beneficial to certain organizations. You look at experimentation beyond the conventional science that we know of, the scientific methods. So you look at experimentations. Um, and earlier, when we talked about the innovation factory, we know that certain ideas have to be put to test. So even that, how you try to extract whether something is useful or not, that's also part of learning. So that's also experimentation, and that is a field of knowledge management that we can look into. Okay. So with that, I stop speaking for now. Are there any questions from you? Are there any questions? Okay. Well, yeah. Yeah. You like to say something, Jared?
Yes, sir. Well, I would like just to ask if it's possible that if we start from novel insight and then we go with the literature and then convention, because I think sometimes
Mm.
there are times that there are very limited literature that we have, and sometimes this technology are not yet available. So,
Okay. Um, from a theoretical standpoint, right? You really cannot start from novel insight because you'll have to start from somewhere, right? Like for example, everybody had to learn convention when they were young. They had to learn the alphabet. They had to learn the numbers. They had to learn from something. So automatically, by sheer life experience, necessarily you would have started from convention and not from novel insight, right? So when you have novel insight, typically you would have some ideas already, perhaps from convention, and you may have read something more about it, which would have been part of your literature review. But without that, without convention, without literature review prior to the formulation of the novel insight, that is tantamount to divine inspiration, probably, right? I mean, you had no idea, you didn't have that basis from somewhere.
mhm,
Well, I mean, and of course, in the history of mankind, it would have been possible somebody had prophetic insight. I mean, that's possible, right? I mean, okay, I'm not going to discount that, but obviously that's out of scope for our discussion. I mean, yeah, you might see Nostradamus as left and right. Okay, fine. They might know something that's specific to them without having to learn what's conventional and what's in the literature. But I mean, just to answer your question, pragmatically, everybody would have to start from convention, and then
mhm,
they would be interested in literature review, and then that's the only time that they can formulate something that is at the level of novel insight.
mhm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? That was a good question, by the way. Any other questions from the group? Okay, well, that's pretty much on the topic on our initial explorations regarding learning about technology. Okay, so I'll stop recording now.